All right, welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving straight into one of those incredibly rare, earth-shattering turning points in human history. We're zeroing in on a span of literally just 53 days in the year 1453. It's a remarkably brief window of time, but it fundamentally shifted the course of human art, science, and absolutely revolutionized the nature of modern warfare. We are, of course, talking about the legendary fall of Constantinople.
So think about that for a second. How exactly does a 1,500-year-old empire, the very last surviving remnant of the mighty Roman world, just collapse in under 2 months? Well, it's this incredibly dramatic tipping point where the ancient medieval world essentially collided head-on with terrifying modern technology. For over a millennium, Constantinople had been this ultimate beacon of culture, with defenses that were thought to be completely impregnable. But to really grasp how it all came crashing down so fast, we need to take a look at the state of the city right before the Ottoman forces actually showed up at the gates. Section 1. The Crown Jewel's Decline. A Weakened Empire. Now, when we think of the Byzantine Empire, it's super easy to picture this sprawling, untouchable superpower. But honestly, by the mid-15th century, it was basically a ghost of its former self. The conflicts prior to the siege had taken a massive toll. Back in 1204, the city was brutally sacked during the Fourth Crusade, which stripped it of so much of its immense wealth. And then tragedy struck again. Between 1346 and 1349, the Black Death swept through and wiped out nearly half of the city's inhabitants. So by the 1450s, the empire was just exhausted. It had shrunk from this vast Mediterranean powerhouse down to just a few square kilometers sitting right outside the city walls. This supposedly impenetrable 800-year-old capital was severely depopulated, politically isolated, and, quite frankly, incredibly vulnerable. Because of all that, the reality on the ground was just the ultimate David versus Goliath scenario. On one side, you've got the 21-year-old Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II. He arrives in April 1453 with this overwhelming force. We're talking anywhere from 55,000 to 80,000 soldiers, backed up by 70 cannons and his elite infantry, the Janissaries. And on the flip side, you have the Byzantine Emperor, Constantine XI, staring down this massive cutting-edge army with barely 7,000 troops. And that number included foreign mercenaries, armed civilians, and even local monks. Their main defense? A set of legendary but definitely aging stone walls.
Section 2. The Ultimate Siege Engine, Gunpowder Warfare.
600, that is the number of pounds a single stone cannonball weighed when fired by the Ottoman artillery. To put that kind of massive scale into perspective, Mehmed actually hired a Hungarian engineer named Orban to cast a 27-foot-long bombard cannon. This weapon was so ridiculously large, it literally took a crew of 60 oxen and hundreds of men just to drag it into position outside Constantinople. Imagine the sheer, deafening power of 600-pound projectiles slamming into stone walls. It was absolutely beyond anything the medieval mind could have even comprehended at the time.
This specific breakthrough in gunpowder artillery was a total game changer. It effectively rendered 800 years of medieval wall and castle designs completely obsolete almost overnight. Firing from over a mile away, Mehmed's massive cannons relentlessly pounded the ancient stone. It created these devastating gaping holes that the desperate defenders had to frantically scramble to repair every single night, using whatever rubble they could find.
But, Mehmed didn't just rely on brute force. He pulled off an act of sheer, audacious tactical genius. See, the Byzantines had totally blocked off the Golden Horn Harbor with this massive iron chain floating on logs, specifically to keep the Ottoman fleet out. So what does Mehmed do? He literally bypasses the water entirely. He builds a road made of greased logs straight up and over the hills of Galata, and he has his troops drag his warships over land, dropping them right into the harbor behind enemy lines. Just imagine the absolute sensory shock for the defenders, waking up to see an enemy fleet that had somehow sailed over a mountain. It completely demoralized the Byzantines and stretched their already incredibly thin forces to the breaking point.
Section 3. Breaching the Unbreakable Walls. The Final Assault.
So as May drags on, the situation is grim. Mehmed actually offered Constantine XI a chance to surrender, promising he could leave the city safely. But Constantine's response is just etched in history. It's this defiant, tragic refusal. He said, "We have reached the mutual decision to die of our own free will, without any regard for our lives." The emperor and his people, they knew full well that no European army was coming to rescue them. They made the conscious choice to stand their ground and face the overwhelming tide, knowing exactly what the ultimate cost would be.
And that cost came due shortly after midnight on Tuesday, May 29, 1453. All hell broke loose. Muhammad unleashed his final all-out offensive. And it wasn't just a blind rush, it was a highly calculated strategy of pure exhaustion. First, he sends in his irregular troops, followed up by the Anatolian forces, literally wearing down the exhausted defenders through sheer numbers. For hours in the pitch black, the vastly outnumbered Byzantines fought desperately. But then, Muhammad unleashed his trump card, the highly trained, completely fresh, and heavily equipped Janissaries. Now, amazingly, even against the Janissaries, the defenders were actually holding the line. But then came the specific event that caused the city to finally fall. Giovanni Giustiniani, the brilliant Genoese commander who had literally been the linchpin holding the entire land defense together, was grievously wounded. When his men pulled him back and evacuated him from the ramparts, it triggered immediate, sudden panic among the ranks. The defensive line just fractured. That single critical retreat was the exact catalyst that caused the city's defenses to irreversibly collapse. The Ottomans poured right through the breaches, and just like that, a 1,500-year-old empire fell.
Section 4. The world forever changed. A new era begins.
The immediate aftermath of this 53-day siege wasn't just a local shift in power. It was a total global transformation. First off, you have the official death of the Roman Empire, a state that traced its direct roots all the way back to 27 BC. Gone. Second, the sheer success of Orban's massive cannons proved without a doubt that gunpowder was the absolute new master of the battlefield. It basically ended the Middle Ages right then and there. Third, this ancient city would become the glorious new capital of the Islamic Ottoman Empire, eventually known universally as Istanbul. But honestly, that last point might actually be the most fascinating ripple effect of all.
Because talk about the ultimate butterfly effect, right? As Constantinople fell, a massive wave of Greek grammarians, philosophers, and scientists fled westward to places like Italy. And they didn't just arrive empty-handed. They brought with them vast amounts of preserved ancient Greco-Roman knowledge, texts, and traditions that Western Europe had basically lost or forgotten. This intellectual migration directly fueled a massive revival of classical learning. In other words, the violent destruction of this ancient city literally sparked the cultural explosion that we now call the European Renaissance. And geopolitically, the loss of Constantinople created this massive power vacuum, which birthed a fascinating concept, the Third Rome. Since there was no longer a Roman emperor sitting in Constantinople, leaders everywhere rushed in to claim that legendary imperial mantle. Mehmed himself actually declared himself the Caesar of the Romans. Meanwhile, all the way up in Moscow, Russian czars started claiming their own spiritual and political inheritance of the Byzantine legacy. The ghost of the Roman Empire was so powerful that it continued to shape international rivalries for centuries. Which really just leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought to ponder. Is the fall of one empire simply the violent birth of our modern era? The 53-day siege of Constantinople in 1453 was undeniably a tragedy for its defenders. But it completely broke the stagnant medieval world wide open. It pushed maritime exploration, it totally revolutionized technology, and it planted the seeds for the Renaissance itself. The violent destruction of that ancient world literally built the very foundations of the world you and I live in today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you next time as we decode another piece of our fascinating history.